Now, what's interesting is that in the 1940s, we have the Great Migration that happens. A lot of African American communities leave from the South and move up north, as well as white families and communities too. So in the 1940s, we see a big pattern of urbanization, people moving to the big city centers like New York and Chicago, Detroit. And so often, what happens is that when urbanization occurs, the musical practices usually change. People bring their musical practices from wherever their home is. So let's say the South, and then they adapt those practices to reflect their new urban settings. And so what happens in the 1940s is that we have the rise of bluegrass music as a representation of urbanizing this type of old time rural country music practice that we just heard. So this is becomes an alternative to the commercial country western music that we had just been listening to. Now we have a newer style of country music, but in an urban form. And it's definitely influenced by the music we just heard, like the Carter Family and the Skillet Lickers. But this bluegrass music is a lot more urban, and it becomes this kind of presentational style of music as opposed to the more participatory style that old time music and the string band music aims to be. So some of the things that really help us hear it as presentational music style, the voices we can hear are in very tight harmonies that you can obviously tell have been arranged carefully, song written carefully, and practiced, right? Because often these singers are singing in a type of echo, call and response like manner. And also, we'll hear a lot of high pitches too, people singing in a higher nasally style, because that's often an aesthetic with presentational music, right? We'll hear tempos, really fast tempos, faster than you can play if you're playing with amateur musicians. In this case, we're hearing a lot more professionals perform, and then things like a very active bass line, right? The bass player is playing incredibly fast and complex rhythms, and other aspects that make this music very presentational, bluegrass in particular, is that the playing is very virtuosic. And when I say that, what I mean is that it's really expert level and flashy music. It's music to be showed off by somebody with high skill level, right? That really is proficient on their instrument or with their voice. And then other things, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, is that you constantly hear this alteration between people who are playing and singing together in the verses of the song, which essentially are kind of like the storytelling element, and then people who solo, kind of like jazz in a sense, right? You have moments where the ensemble is playing separately from one another, and then moments when they're playing together. And so let's take a listen to this now, this bluegrass group that's performing on stage. Notice the framing of the mics and the instruments and the way they're dressed. And just notice how tight the music is, because it's a lot more professional than the amateur styles of music making we heard before. So let's take a listen. Notice the audience, right? And then hear how fast that is. All right. So we saw a very similar thing happen when we were talking about musical practices in Peru. Remember that we had the Conima indigenous highland region, right, with the siku practices and the very participatory style. And then when people migrated into the newer urban settings, we start to hear that transformation into an urban style or reappropriation of that music, right? So that's a really common pattern in music history in general, is the urbanization of folk or indigenous music styles when people migrate into urban or city centers. So